Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the Mardiyah Show, where we are meeting Muslims where they are. I'm your host, Shadid Muhammad. In today's topic, we're going to talk about some of the pressures that many of our young children find themselves confronted with attending Western universities and colleges here in America. Attending these universities, many of our children find themselves in an impasse with the desire to get married, as well as the wishes of their parents to finish college before they actually decide to get married. And in the process, these children, they find themselves caught in a dilemma and need guidance and direction to help them navigate through these adult choices, which this is what it is. Unfortunately, in many of these universities and in these colleges, you will find that the male to female ratio is daunting. U.S. News reported that LaSalle, for example, LaSalle University here in Philadelphia, the male to female ratio is 38% to 62%. That means that 62% of the population of students on the university campus are females, which means that over half of the population of the university are females. Another example of this is Montclair State University in Montclair, New Jersey. U.S. News reported that their male to female ratio is between 38%, 36 to 38% male to 64 to 68% female, 64 to 66% female, which is still the greater population are females. And it puts the male children, the Muslim male children that are seeking to pursue higher education, it puts them in a very precarious situation. So how do we help them navigate through this situation? Number one, that as Muslims, we need to understand that many of our children, when we send them off to college, they're not equipped to tackle the temptations that they're going to be confronted with, especially for those of us who allow our children to live on college campuses. You're talking about co-ed dorms, you're talking about parties, and almost every un-Islamic sacrilegious behavior that you can think of. Secondly, the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned in the authentic hadith where he said, إن الدنيا حلوة خضرة وإن الله مستخلفكم فيها لينظر كيف تعملون فاتقوا الدنيا واتقوا النساء فإن فتنة بني إسرائيل كانت فإن أول فتنة بني إسرائيل كانت في النساء. The Prophet ﷺ mentioned in this authentic hadith, and his words were so profound and relevant as much as it was then today. He said that the dunya, the life of this world, hulwun khadira, it is green and sweet. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala establishes his servants here in this life, in this dunya, لِيَنْظُرَ كَيْفَ تَعْمَلُونَ, to watch you, to see how you act in this life. He said, فَاتَّقُوا الدُّنْيَا وَاتَّقُوا النِّسَاء. So fear the dunya and fear women. Stay away from the dunya, or be cautious about the dunya and be cautious about women, because indeed the first fitna, the first trial or tribulation that afflicted Bani Israel was women. And so there's a real danger here. There's a real danger here that many of our children, that we kind of dismiss under the guise that we want our children to get a good education and put off marriage until afterwards. And obviously I'm taking the devil's advocate position of the parents who have this sentiment when it comes to their children getting married when they go to college. Not only this, the Prophet ﷺ, he also informed us that in an authentic hadith, that if any one of you sees, and obviously he's talking to the men in the community, if any one of you sees a woman that creates a desire in you, then let him go home to his wife. فَإِنَّمَا مَعَهَا مَا مَعَهَا. For indeed his wife has what the woman has that he saw, that created that desire. So he's given a solution to go home and satisfy that desire with your wife. But when you look at college kids in a university, young Muslim children, they're not married. So when that desire is aroused, how do they satisfy that? The Prophet ﷺ said that go home to your wife because she has what she has. But if there's no one to go home to, then what do you do with that desire? Do we just, do we suppress it? Because even though we suppress a desire, it only manifests in another way. It doesn't go away. It only manifests in another, type of behavior that may be more self-destructive. So what is left for our children to do? And today, inshallah ta'ala, I have with me my beloved guest. He is no stranger to the Mardiyah Show. He is also a professor, an adjunct professor at Montclair State University in the college, the Department of Psychology. He also has his own practice in Hoboken, New Jersey, as well as another group practice in New York City. Please help me welcome my guest, Dr. Raymond Brock.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thanks for coming on the show.
Alhamdulillah, it's always a blessing to be here.
Alhamdulillah. So I want to jump right into this topic. Do you think that there are a lot of cultural differences and prejudices with many of the parents who take the position, or this more rigid, hardline position, that they don't want their children to get married while they are attending colleges?
Alhamdulillah, I've had this conversation with many people before, and one of the things that's very important is that the fact I want to open up with, which is a slight diversion from your question, the fact that we talk about marriage so much as Muslims.
Okay.
And marriage is half of our deen, is half of our responsibility in our religion that we owe to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But I've said this before and I'll say it again, when we consider that marriage is half of your religion, I always ask people, is your Islamic knowledge, is half of your Islamic knowledge about marriage? Because while we have these conversations all the time, we find ourselves pushing young people into getting married, pushing our peers into getting married, pushing brothers in the masjid that we barely even know into getting married.
Do shahadas. The first thing they do when they take shahada is say, you need to get married.
Alhamdulillah,
exactly.
Sisters take shahada. She's walking out with the kimar in her hand, and the brother is like, so subhanAllah, I think marriage as a whole, broader than this issue of college students is a problem in our community because we're not addressing it properly. So when you talk about culture, I think that is one of the facets of the issues that we have in the Muslim community related to marriage. Because alhamdulillah, I think that there's a little bit of a double standard as it relates to males and females. So, I can't say I've seen very many people pushing their children to stay unmarried. Right. What I have seen is that parents are either pushing their children to stay unmarried so that they can finish their careers. Finish their educations and then get married. But what I found with the sisters is that women are really only encouraged to get degrees so that they can be competitive for husbands.
Okay.
There's just so many different issues related to it. I don't want to meander in this conversation, but you find it's a double-edged sword that there are parents who don't want to let their children get married, and it's really for cultural reasons. You're not ready, but they also don't prepare them.
Exactly.
For getting married.
Exactly.
They kind of raise them not necessarily to be autonomous, not to be responsible. They don't have conversations with each other. What I've learned from a lot of the family therapy I'm doing is that a lot of parents don't even talk to their children about sex. And they say that because culturally that wasn't our experience. I myself was not raised talking to my parents about sex, and I will not talk to my child about sex, right? So you had started with this opening comment about that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in this hadith that many of us know said go home to your wife because she has what this woman has, and believe it or not, that opens the door for our young men as their parents prevent them from getting married and don't educate them around marriage. That really pushes a lot of our young men into pornography. And that's a conversation that we're not having as well.
I want to get back to that. That's very important. You open up, you crack the door a little bit. We're gonna open it all the way up. Okay, so going back to my initial question is that
I'm sorry.
Even with many of the Sahaba, as tribal as many of them were, there were cultural prejudices that were imposed on certain people simply because they were not from certain tribes or whatever. I'll give you an example. One of the examples is the hadith of Julaybib, who was an African, who was previously a slave, and he earned his freedom. And the Prophet ﷺ had a strong affinity to him, and had a very strong closeness with him. And when he went to go advocate for Julaybib to get married, the woman from the Ansar, she said, I would never marry my daughter to Julaybib. Okay, another example is with the Prophet ﷺ's wife, Zainab bint Jahash. Before she married the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet encouraged her to marry Zayd ibn Haritha, who was his slave, and eventually he freed him, and he still opted to live with the Prophet ﷺ. So when the Prophet made this proposal for Zayd ibn Haritha, Zainab, she said, Ana khayrun minhu. I'm better than Zayd, meaning because she was from the tribe al-Asadiyya, and Zayd ibn Haritha, he was an ex-slave. He used to be a slave. So she's like, I'm not marrying him. And even though they got married, they were only married for about a year. And then eventually the Prophet ﷺ himself married her. So we can see that these cultural differences or prejudices, they were real. There were real issues amongst the Sahaba.
And I think one of the most important points to point out is that during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, people would tell him to his face, despite all of the Islamic evidence, despite being in front of the Prophet ﷺ, we always talk about how pious we would be if we lived during his time and we had met him. But I often point out how people really struggle with their Islam in front of him.
Absolutely.
As well. And so there's nationalism is a huge issue as it relates to some of the roadblocks that people place in front of their children in terms of getting married. You can only marry a man from this village or that, community or what have you. You have to marry a man who looks like this or that. And
the prejudices don't necessarily have to do with nationality. Prejudice could be economic, financial. Oh, he's not financially where we want you to marry. We want you to marry into a...
And to be honest with you, I think that a lot of the trouble our young people are having with marriage, and there are no young people to contribute to this conversation, but in my experiences with them as a therapist and as an instructor, a lot of the students feel like they're put upon by what I have identified as self-hatred, right?
Elaborate.
Cultural self-hatred. Cultural insecurity, right? So you can only marry somebody who's an engineer or a doctor. You can only be an engineer or a doctor.
Wow.
Where does that come from?
Absolutely.
Right? That comes from a desire for prestige, right? Occupational prestige and status. But where does somebody need something like that as it relates to you're compensating for something that's you feel is lacking within yourself?
Exactly.
And so it has translated into only pushing their children into certain majors and certain careers, but then also only allowing their children to pursue people who have these careers as well, right? Because you're going to shame the family. You're going to shame me in front of the community. So marriage is not about something we owe to Allah.
Okay.
It's not about something, it's not a religious sacrament. It's a community, it's something aspirational to raise our status within the community. I mean, it has become the Muslim community's way of keeping up with the Joneses.
MashaAllah.
And so, subhanAllah, I think a lot of that comes into play. I mean, there are a lot of people who are being prevented from being married, but then we also have to think about the fact that a lot of people are being pushed into being married, because we have in the Muslim community, if you're 22, you're old now. And no one's ever going to marry you. You're 25, you're old now. No one's ever going to want to marry you. So there's a lot of mixed messages. And the one thing in psychology, when you send a child a lot of mixed messages, right? This is okay today, but not tomorrow. They don't know how to behave. right? You know, because they're not sure if today is the day where it's okay or when it's not. And so when you tell a child you have to get married, but no one will ever marry you, this is when you start to see that there's a lot of like emotional conflict, a lot of emotional distress experienced around the women and the men, you know, because sometimes we only think about the sisters getting pressured into getting married, but the brothers are really under the same pressure too. I mean, it's a different context. It definitely looks different, but it's still pressure.
And to add to that, a lot of, you know, it's almost like we prepare our daughters for failure, because we encourage them to be pious, to maintain their chastity, to not sleep around, and to wait for the, you know, the proper time when they get married, and to go to college and get good degrees and things like this. And then once they get all the way up there, they realize that there's not too many men.
Qualified brothers.
You know, qualified brothers, you know, there. So it's basically, we're prepping them.
So which is worse? I mean,
You know.
because you quoted the statistics, right? That it's essentially it's 6 to 4, right?
Yeah.
It's 6 women for every 4 men, right? Which
Exactly.
which in the that's just the college population, right? It's like 2 to 1 in like the global population, right? So when you talk about, it's already 6 to 4, and then when you talk about the upper echelons of education, it's even worse, you know. So because the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says you have to marry your equal, and so you're already putting women in an unequal footing because they have to kind of marry a man who is not necessarily their equal.
Exactly.
You know, and in a lot of different ways. And so I'll tell you something. A client, a woman called me to make an appointment, and she had talked to me about a previous marriage she was in, and she had been seeing a therapist, and she shared with me, and I thought this was important. I'm not saying it's true. You're getting us on the record, but I'm not saying it's true. Okay. But I thought it was very poignant, a very poignant point she made. She said, if a man marries a woman who is not as the same status as he is, right?
Social status,
okay. Right? Educational, economic, what have you. She can lift herself up, right, to become his equal. But oftentimes what you find is when a woman marries a man who's below her social status, he will not lift himself up.
Is that by his choice, or because the woman kind of gets comfortable with the fact that she's higher than him and puts her foot on his neck, or kind of enjoys being, you know?
No, you know,
or is that the man's choice or his inferiority?
Look, I think that it's because we're not adequately preparing our men to be men. You know what I mean? I think that so we're raising college students, we're raising them to get good educations, but they have book knowledge, right? But this is like having knowledge of Islam, right? But not being able to implement it, right? So you have a lot of people with education who don't know how to be men. And this is when you find the trouble in the young Muslim community, especially in the colleges and the Muslim student associations, is that the sisters, have hearts, and they open their hearts to these young brothers who, like many people in college, right, are really just kind of out to have fun, looking for sisters to kind of have a good time with, and they string them along a little bit. Okay. You know, and the sister will, remain in a relationship that she knows is not Islamically appropriate with a brother, because the prospect of marriage is there. And we have to talk about that, right? So a lot of people are being prevented from being married, but at the same time are being exposed to the potential to be in a relationship. Okay. Gotcha. Right? And so you have like this halal dating, right? Where
is there such thing as
no? No, you know what? To be honest with you,
there's some parents that actually promote their children dating first.
Yeah, which is true. No, it's true. Listen, I'll tell you what I tell non-Muslims. Right, there is a such thing as halal dating, because the first thing that non-Muslims say to me is, "You can't date." Right? And I say, well, no, we can't date, but I call it supervised dating, right? Because if I'm interested in a sister, I have to reach out to her father, right? And if the sister's interested in me, she should tell her father, who should reach out to me, right? And then when we meet each other, we can meet each other. Let's say we want to go out to dinner or something like that. We can go out to dinner, but we need to have each other's respect. Exactly, right? So, I mean, this is super, we're not dating per se, but we're getting to know each other. We're doing it in the context of having someone there to protect us and to watch over us. You know what I mean? So, we've gotten kind of far away from that, because as our parents have become less and less involved in our lives, and as American culture, which is really, really work oriented, pushes more parents into work, longer hours, more jobs, more part-time jobs, they're just less involved. There's less like contact hours with your children.
Yeah.
And I think that becomes the bigger issue, because we're preventing our children from getting married because we're saying they're not ready, which is justifiably so. They are not ready sometimes.
So is there a specific time or circumstance in which we can say that our son or our daughter is actually ready, quote unquote, ready for marriage? And I'm stating that because there has been this myth in especially the African American Muslim community that the moment our son or daughter shows signs that they're ready to start having sex, they're ready for marriage.
Puberty, right?
So basically what we're doing is we're associating the desire to have sex with marriage.
Yeah.
And, me, I have a problem with that, because just because you are ready to have sex does not mean that you are ready to get married. One does not equal the other.
Correct.
So leads me to my next question, which is, what are some of the risks that our children find themselves subjected to if they do not get married while attending universities, and especially those that live on college campuses? Are there any risks? Yeah,
of course. I mean, it's not necessarily, marriage is not necessarily just a solution, right? But you have to have adequate parenting, a good, strong Islamic social network around you to protect you from things. But of course, you're at risk for premarital sex. You're at risk for getting into drugs and alcohol. But alcohol is a drug. I don't know why we say drugs and alcohol. Mashallah. But so drugs and alcohol, hanging out with the wrong crowd. Today is Jumu'ah, alhamdulillah, and the imam at the masjid I went to, he was talking about spending time with the wrong people and the right people. And alhamdulillah, he had the presence of mind, not just because sometimes we beat up on the non-Muslims and we say non-Muslims this, non-Muslims that.
People of other faiths.
Correct, right?
I think that's more of an easy to digest term,
Mashallah,
as opposed to saying non-Muslims. It's like
people who are not Muslim, people who do not identify, who identify either as having some faith or not having,
just people of other faiths.
Correct. Yes. But alhamdulillah, the one thing that he did mention was, he said, or Muslims who are not good influences. Because you can be around Muslims, but they're not good influences on you. So you have a lot of leeway to fall into that. I had a brother say to me once that the MSAs are like hookup spots. Really? Which can be true, mashallah. We know it's...
Do you notice that in the universities that you work?
It's mashallah. It's Dhuhr time. We all going to go pray. We know who's like, buddied up with who. And there's just not a lot, believe it or not. So, and this becomes a bigger problem because we like to beat up on people who are of other faiths, right? Mm-hmm. But if you go to a lot of the Islamic organizations on campus, as much as conservative Muslims are called out for the way in which they go about, correcting people or judging people or castigating people, or what have you, some of the stereotypes about how, conservative Muslims will treat people who are not necessarily so conservative. But what you find is that conservative Muslims are also shunned and rejected when they're in a community where, dating and courtship and all this kind of stuff is happening outside of the context of involving your parents, right? And when people are trying to correct that, they're really pushed away or pushed out or made to feel uncomfortable for being, the party pooper, the one who comes along and wants to force everybody. So I think those are the things that you can get yourself into when you're on a college campus. And it's not the college campus per se, but it's how you prepare your children to go.
Okay, so since we're talking about the risky behavior that Muslim children find themselves, in when they don't get married and they have these desires, you were broaching the topic of pornography.
Yeah.
And that's a big issue. When I was growing up, there was no internet, there was no, you couldn't see pornography. It wasn't readily available to you like that. If you went into your mother's room and you found a VCR tape stashed somewhere, okay. Other than that, it wasn't accessible. Now your child has an iPhone that with a click of a button, they can be introduced to every single porn that is available. Right? So this in itself, how dangerous is it from a psychological perspective for Muslims. I mean, we all know. I mean, it would really be beating a dead horse if we approached it from an Islamic perspective, because we all know the textual evidences from the Quran and the Sunnah. But that, as we mentioned before, that's not the issue.
Yeah.
What are some of the psychological effects that watching pornography has on the males as well as the females?
All right, so starting with the males, right? When you're talking about watching pornography, the first thing it does is it gives the male an inaccurate perception of what sex is all about, right? Because the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says to not approach a woman as, you know, as if like as she's an animal. You know, you definitely. I mean, you know, he was all about courtship and romance. Alhamdulillah, he was, you know, our leader, and he led in so many different ways, and one of the ways in which he led was to show us how to have a romantic relationship with our partners.
I like that. Romantic.
Alhamdulillah.
Romantic.
He was very romantic.
Right?
Alhamdulillah.
Okay.
You know, the
so
Prophet
chivalry is not dead.
No, subhanAllah. You know, I had a family come in, and I had asked the parents how often they go on date nights and how much they hug each other and all that kind of stuff, you know, cheesy stuff, which I think is amazing. And they looked at me, they both looked at me because I'm a convert, you know, alhamdulillah. Okay. So they looked at me like, he's a convert, you know, he doesn't get it. So then, okay. So then they looked at each other and they looked at me and they said, brother, that's so American. Right? SubhanAllah. You know, and then I explained to them hadith by hadith about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his romantic relationship, right? And how there's a sunnah even for how to be a romantic wife and how to be a romantic husband. And, you know, when you watch pornography, none of that is included, right? None of the affection, none of the love, none of the care, none of that kind of stuff. I mean, it's not even about Allah, and it gives them faulty assumptions about what a woman's body is supposed to look like, what kind of acts she's willing to do or not do, what kind of acts are permissible or not Islamically even. When a woman does or does not want to have sex, right? You watch a pornography, the woman always wants to have sex, and she's willing to have sex however you want, whenever you want, and with whoever else you know you want to be there with you or watching or what have you, and so it also teaches a lot of men to objectify women. Yeah. You know, truthfully. And look, you know, a lot of people have their own opinions about pornography in terms of, you know, women are making conscious decisions to participate in it. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the people who view it. You know, the people, the viewer begins to objectify women, and that is undeniable. The research shows that there's a lot of campaigns that they're not related to Islam, but there's a lot of campaigns actually trying to help people who are addicted to pornography, because it does affect your brain, and it does become something of a self-sustaining cycle. What I found, especially in my work as a therapist and in the research, is that for men, watching pornography is the same as what we consider self-medicating with using drugs. Okay. Right? Where people turn to drugs not necessarily to feel better, but to not feel bad. Right? And men are turning to pornography in the same ways. You know, they're having frustrations in their lives, one thing or another, you know, with work or family or with their wives in particular. And pornography is just an easy escape. It's kind of like video game addiction in that sense, right? So does it have a different effect on girls than it does the boys? So what is the effect on the girls? Well, and this is the problem, right? So, you know, again, I said the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says that you're supposed to marry your equal, and women are not doing that. Women have been taught and have been socialized in our culture, right? Women have been socialized in our culture and in their own indigenous cultures as well, to be subservient to men and to settle, right? So they're not marrying men who are their equals, and so I think that same thing happens with watching pornography, not just with pornography, but in our culture as well as it relates to socializing our women, where, you know, they just accept whatever it is that men offer up to them, and men learn that they don't really necessarily have to offer anything but their best foot forward. And that is part of the problem as well. As it relates to marriage in the Muslim community, because sisters learn to be objectified, they don't learn their true worth and their true value, and worst of all is that they're not willing to stand up for it. Absolutely. Right? Because they're concerned about the consequences of standing up for it, right? The consequence of standing up for it is that this brother is going to potentially leave me. And sometimes having a person is better than not having them, regardless of what the circumstance is. And that's not necessarily true, because sometimes you don't understand that you're making space for someone so that Allah can send the right person in, and will you be patient enough to wait for the right person?
For the right person.
So again, this a lot of this come back to the worth that we're instilling in our children, especially with our young girls.
Yeah, I mean, not to get off the topic, but with this whole campaign of bringing our girls back, right?
Yeah.
They're talking about the young girls that were kidnapped from Nigeria.
Yes, subhanallah.
And I put a tweet
freedom.
out this morning, just kind of frustrated with this whole campaign because it's all commercialized.
Yeah, that's what it's American.
And I said that, we have women right here in America who were kidnapped from Africa. Mm-hmm. They're scantily clad in music videos. They're wearing weave.
mashallah.
They're bleaching their skin. They're putting makeup on, trying to look more European. Than
That's
they do
socially
African,
acceptable, though.
right? So we're talking about. So let's bring these girls home, right? Because these are African women that were kidnapped and brought here to America. It's like that whole incident is a reflection to America.
So is it safe to say that it's Stockholm syndrome then? Right, like because if you're saying that these women are women who were kidnapped and then kind of brainwashed, right? Because if you were to stop any of these women on the street, would they react to you as if you are enlightening them and all that kind of? I mean, do they share the same values? You know what I mean? So, have we bought into an ideal? I say this, especially as an African American Muslim, is that we've been placated, and that's why we don't really fight for more power. In our communities, especially even in the Muslim community, as Muslims as a whole, we've been placated. We have enough money to feed ourselves. We have enough money to, buy cars and homes and all of that kind of stuff. And so we get distracted by having and not recognizing that our rights are absent.
Wow.
You know what I mean? So, and it's the same thing. If you stopped any of those women on the street and look, again, this is not me decrying anybody. You have a lakum dinukum.
Yeah.
Right? Lakum dinukum. And Allah, He says in the Quran, that to let whoever will believe, and let whoever will disbelieve, let them disbelieve. Right? So people are totally free to kind of live their own lives and are not judging anybody. But would people feel like that? Would the Muslims even feel like that? If you came to a Muslim and you said, look, this might not necessarily be the best way to live your life or to practice your religion, would they feel like that?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So we're having this conversation, but understand that while we might be speaking to a lot of people in the Muslim community, there are other people who feel like we're totally off base with that.
Absolutely.
And so how do we begin to speak to them in a way that they can understand as it relates to Qur'an and Sunnah, where they see the value of immersing themselves more in an Islamic lifestyle?
Okay, so let's go back to this conversation about college culture and marriage. When is the right time to introduce or to encourage our children to get married? Is there a right time? Should everybody's situation be looked at individually?
Alhamdulillah, I just came from Calgary. I was giving a talk out there, and there was an imam also giving a talk, and he spoke directly to that when he said that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says when a person's able to get married, that they should get married, right? And what a lot of people take is what you said, right? Which is like they've hit puberty, they have a desire to have sex, they should get married. And what he did was he explained that in the tafsir, it really actually means, right, that when a person is actually able, right, able, right?
And what does able entail?
It entails a lot, right?
Exactly.
When a person has the resources in place, when a person is mentally and emotionally mature, I mean, think about it. During the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, people were getting married very young, but they were men and women very young.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
here we have extended adolescence. People aren't really mature until mid-20s.
Exactly.
Really getting it together, trying to figuring out what they want to do with their lives. And so I can't say there's a hard and fast rule, but what I can say is that number one, you need to be preparing yourself for marriage. You need to prepare yourself for adulthood, and you can't just leave it on your parents. A lot of people will recognize, especially college students, they'll recognize that their parents have kind of fallen short a little bit in terms of guidance and direction just into adulthood.
Okay.
And when you recognize that, that means that the onus is now on you.
On you, exactly.
To do it. You can't just sit back and, my mom, it can't work like that.
Yeah.
Right? You now recognize the problem, and if you see better than your parents saw, then you kind of have to do.
Exactly. When you know better, you do better.
You have to do better. And so this is the same thing, that there's no particular age, I think that it's a maturity issue. I think it's a responsibility issue. You have to start having conversations with people. And if you can't have them with your parents, this is for anybody in the audience or anybody at home watching, right? If you feel like you're ready to get married and you have a desire to get married, then that means you actually have to start doing your research. Look at what college is all about in the first place, because college students complain about having to take all these nonsense classes. Like, why do I have to take this anyway? But college is really...
And you get a chance to explain
from
a faculty perspective, right?
And, and as a former student myself, alhamdulillah, I recognized very early on that everything is a step. Listen, there are a lot of steps in your house on the way to the second floor, right? We can solve that. We can cut that in half and just make the steps bigger, right? But we make it gradual so that it's easier. Right, and college is done the same way, right? Like there's a gradual escalation of responsibility and difficulty, and I wish I could remember this quote, right? And it's, because I do this for a lot of my students with time management and at the university, and it says to them, it says like the main task in college is learning how to do what ought to be done when it ought to be done because it should be. And I think that's a major lesson that you have to learn in college, and every part of the college experience is supposed to instill that in you so that when you graduate, you're a much more well-rounded person. And I think this is the same thing with marriage, right? You have to really put in the time and effort to understand what makes a marriage successful. I ask a lot of, let me just finish this thought, but I ask a lot of people, how much time did they spend talking to their parents or anybody else who they know is married? Right, or was married before actually making the decision to get married, and so many people say so little time. We're not really investing ourselves. Right?
Proper preparation prevents poor performance.
Correct. We spend all of this time in college to prepare ourselves for our careers, which is supposed to be lifelong.
Marriage.
You should be putting the same effort into marriage.
And you find that the Prophet ﷺ, with many of the youth in his community, he encouraged them to get married. He never said, and a lot of them were students of his, he never said to them, finish your studies with me and then go get married. He said, Ya ma'shara shabab min istata'a minkum al-ba'a falyatazawwaj. Oh, group of young men. And he addressed the young men because he can't address the women because they have fathers, and their fathers are the ones who determine when they are ready to marry. But the young boys in the community, most of whom were new converts to Islam, they traveled from other places like Abu Huraira, who came from Yemen. You had Salman al-Farisi, who came from Persia. You had other people who came, Abdullah ibn Salam, who was a Jewish guy who embraced Islam. So you had a lot of the young men in the community that were converts to Islam, and he was literally encouraging them to get married. And today you'll find that it's like, okay, put off marriage, not right now, finish your studies. Okay, but that child knows what they are experiencing. They know, and for the parents to just dismiss that on the basis of, I sent you to school to get an education, not to get married, and we don't have a contingency plan. You know what I mean? When the child goes to school to get married, that doesn't necessarily mean that something else is not going to, some obstacles are not going to come in the way, and we need to figure out how to navigate through that. And simply dismissing their passion or their desire to get married without even, it's almost like what some sisters do with polygyny, right? The conversation of polygyny. Come on, I don't want to hear it. Don't even bring that word up in my house, right? At least if you entertain the conversation, you get an opportunity to persuade them against the, women don't understand the power of their words when they're talking to the men, but
we've done that to the sisters though. Like if sisters hate polygamy, it's because we did it. To be honest, you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm gonna keep it real, right?
I don't know if you want to go there.
No, right? I didn't bring it up. You brought it up. So I don't know. If the wheels on that car are falling off, it's because we the ones driving it recklessly. You know what I'm saying? So I mean,
okay. So you're gonna get a lot of people.
It's like 42. It's like 42 against 1, and I'm gonna say, sisters, fear Allah, fear Allah. I
agree with you to some degree. I just think that naturally, as American Muslims growing up in this society, we are already indoctrinated with monogamy. You know what I'm saying? With this false sense of one male, one female.
We're indoctrinated with a double standard, and again, we're kind of off topic, all right? But that's the thing that's always astounding about Islam, because I can date, right? or I can be married and I can fool around and mess around with all these other women, and that's okay. You know, like it's kind of frowned upon if you do it too much. I mean, this is like Roman times. In Roman times, it was okay to kind of philander a little bit. But if you were given too much to your sexual desires, it was seen as problematic. And I think it's the same thing in our culture today, right? It's okay to kind of womanize a little bit, you know what I'm saying? Like to be a little bit of a player. But to do it too much, then you become a dog. And that's the bad thing. But Islamically speaking, right? If you want to be with more than one person, you have to marry that person. Yeah. You have to actually take up a responsibility. You have to take up in a manner with Allah.
Absolutely.
For that person. And, unfortunately, again, many brothers are not holding up that end of the bar. They found polygamy to be their way to be players a little bit. And that's not necessarily right. But, I think that we're given two opposing and competing messages. Living here in this country, living in America, and maybe living in other countries. But
okay, so my last question to you is, if as a psychologist and a counselor, if a young college student came into your office and said, I want to get married. However, when I pitched this idea to my parents, they were totally opposed to it. However, I'm going to date the brother or I'm going to date the sister until, Allah allows my parents to see the permissibility of me getting married. How do you, as a counselor, as a psychologist, as a professional, how do you handle a situation?
You have to weigh the consequences with the successes that you could face, right? Because I can't divorce myself from being Muslim. Okay. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that any woman who gets married without the consent of her father, the marriage is batil. Okay. Right?
Batil, you mean invalid? Right?
Yes, correct. Okay. Right? Nikahu had batil. He said it 3 times, right? Right. So number one, you can't do the right thing the wrong way.
MashaAllah. I love it.
Right, you can't do the right thing the wrong way.
Can I tweet that?
MashaAllah, alhamdulillah.
I'm going to tweet that.
No, because look, then we get into the idea that parents won't allow their children to get married. And so, which is bad in and of itself, but then that prompts the children to go about doing it the wrong way.
Exactly.
Which again, I had mentioned this to you earlier in an earlier conversation. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he mentions this in the hadith. He says that if you prevent a righteous man who comes for your daughter in marriage, if you prevent them from getting married, there will be fitna. Exactly. And the fitna of it is you have children eloping, getting involved with each other, physically and romantically outside of,
permissible Islamically.
You know what I'm saying? So
wait a minute. Go back to the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said that if a righteous man comes to you for your daughter for marriage, then marry them. And if you don't, there will be fitna. There will be much fitna. Correct. So you're saying that when the children come to the parents and pitch this idea of getting married and we kind of dismiss that, the fitna that comes as a result of that could
be what because these are two people who really want to be with each other, and it's not to say that you should just marry them tomorrow. But that's because when we talk about anything in Islam, right, there are necessary conditions for everything in our religion.
Absolutely.
And so if you're encouraging people to get married, you should be encouraging them toward the necessary conditions that allow them to get married too, right? Okay. So it's a process. So if you don't approve of your children getting married yet, right? Okay, then I will be okay with you all getting married, but here are the things that you need to do to demonstrate that you're able to be married to one another.
Like what, for example?
To be honest with you, getting good grades. Right?
So getting good grades is a demonstration that they are actually mature enough to handle.
Have you met a college student?
Right.
That's a feat. That's quite an accomplishment. Alhamdulillah. No, because there's so many things competing for your attention, and there are so many different distractions from your own desires that it can be very, very hard to stay focused and get good grades. And that means if you can maintain good grades, not just have a stellar semester, right, but really have consistently very good grades, it shows that you're somebody who can be very determined, who's goal-oriented, who can achieve success and repeat it.
Alhamdulillah, we've come to the conclusion of the first episode of the Mardiyah Show titled College Culture and Marriage in Contemporary Times. On this show, we concentrated on the pressures that many young Muslim students are faced with while attending Western universities and colleges unmarried in pursuit of higher education. We highlighted the statistics surrounding the male to female ratio in many of these universities, as well as the precarious situations that many of them find themselves in. We took a look at the familial pressures of excelling academically, as well as the wishes of many of the parents of these children, many of whom stress delaying marriage until after their studies are complete. There's no one-size-fits-all solution to a dilemma of this magnitude. However, the goal of this episode was to present both points on this issue fairly in a healthy dialogue format in order to provide an Islamically sound resolution to a continuing problem affecting Muslims globally. It is my hope that the stories that were shared on this episode, as well as the episode that came before it, that we can draw lessons from these stories and we can apply them to our lives, as the mantra of the show is meeting Muslims where they are. So stay tuned for the next episode of the Mardiyah Show, titled The Phenomenon of Ramadan, where we will be talking about some of the health benefits of fasting during the month of Ramadan, as well as the Islamic legislative rulings related to fasting for both men and women. I am your host, Shadeed Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. When the last 10 nights of Ramadan approached, the Prophet ﷺ كان يشد مئزره وأيقظ أهله وأحيا ليله. That when the last 10 nights of Ramadan approached, he would tighten his belt, which means that he would lessen his intake of food. All right? Because the lessening of the intake of food, it kills the sexual appetite.